do you get to be a guest at someone else's party? Let me know below how you're going to be spending your holiday. I always love to hear about holiday traditions of others and get inspired by them. Today's episode, I have something a little bit different for you. I'm going to be sharing my top 10 episodes as part of this Thanksgiving podcast feast. This is a feast that's a little bit different than the norm this time of year. This feast is meant for you to be inspired, for you to get excited about launching a podcast of your very own. I'm so glad that you are joining me live today, watching the replay, or listening over on the podcast. Happy Thanksgiving Eve, everyone, and welcome to episode number 249 of the In a Weekend podcast. I'm your host, Young Pratt, and I'm on a mission to help 1,000 fellow female business owners on their quest to create and launch their podcasts in as little as a weekend. By learning how to repurpose the content you're already creating, a podcast can become one of the biggest tools in your toolkit to help you serve more people, reach more of those that need to hear your message, and to make the kind of impact that you dream of making. Welcome to this podcast feast of an episode. Today I want to share 10 episodes with you that can help you on your podcasting journey. Before we dive in, I do want to say that today's episode is being brought to you by Podcast in a Weekend, my weekend class that helps people just like you create and launch a podcast fast. In the class, we strip away all the extraneous stuff, get to the meat to help you launch that podcast that you've been dreaming about. The doors are open for the final time in 2019 and the final time this decade. And this will be the final time that Podcast in a Weekend is being offered at this current price, which is just $397. So if you're dreaming of launching a podcast, good news. We still have 5 weeks to make that happen, and you can get your podcast up and running as fast as a weekend. So if you're ready to dive in and launch your podcast, just head over to today's show notes at youngpratt.com/249 and save your seat. All the details are right there for you to dive into, and I would be absolutely honored to walk this podcasting adventure with you. And yes, it is quite an adventure, and I'm really excited for yours. So let's dive into today's episodes. We have 10 of them, and I do have my notes, so if you see me looking off camera, you'll know that I am just referring to my notes to make sure that I keep myself on track. Are you ready? The first episode that I want you to go back and listen to is number 237. Are you pod-crastinating? You may have heard about procrastinating, but find out what pod-crastinating is, how I learned it, and how you can know if you are experiencing that yourself. Episode number 2 is 238. You as podcaster. If you want to start a podcast, we dive into ways or things that may be holding you back, how to overcome them, and dream big of what a podcast can do for you and your business. The third episode I want you to listen to is 239, The Advantage of Live Video for Podcasters. By far, starting your podcast with video content is the easiest way to create your podcast. Inside of Podcast in a Weekend, I'll show you how to turn videos like this into podcasts automatically using the right tools and resources. We talk about why live video is so important for you as a business owner, as a content creator, and especially as a podcaster. when you learn how to be strategic and repurpose the content you're already creating. The fourth episode I'd love for you to go back and take a listen to is 240. Start your podcast with what you already have. When you think about podcasting, you may think about needing a bunch of fancy equipment, a recording studio, and all the bells and whistles you likely see from pro podcasters on social media. Well, I'll be the first to tell you that you don't actually need all the fancy stuff yet. When you're just starting out, I don't want the thought of having to invest in all that equipment stop you from doing what you want to do, and that is launching your podcast. In this episode, I'll share with you 3 examples of what starting with what you have may look like for you. The 5th episode I want you to dive into is the first in a 4-part mini-series called Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life. In this 4-episode mini-series, we dive into all the different ingredients you get to choose and add or subtract as the creator of your podcast. In the first of the series, we dive into 2 of the spices you get to add to your podcast, and they are the type of show you want to create and your show's personality. And that brings us to the 7th episode, or the 6th episode that I'd like you to listen to, which is part 2 in the mini-series, Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life, part 2. In this episode, we dive into another spice, which is your audience, and about how knowing who you want to speak to on your podcast is going to go a long way in helping you create the content to share on your show. That, of course, brings us to the 3rd part in the mini-series, episode number 243, Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life, part 3. The spice talked about on this episode is all about frequency. And frequency really refers to how often do you want to create and publish your content? How often will your listeners hear from you? Setting a consistent schedule, deciding on your frequency will help you in becoming a podcaster long-term because you'll have a strategy behind it. That brings us to the 8th episode in this 10-part series, and number 4 in the mini-series, Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life. And this one is all about the different ways you can choose to record your show. On that episode, I bring on a guest who happens to be a graduate of Podcast in a Weekend in the very first round. Nicole Thompson is now the host of the Build Your Wealth podcast. And in this episode, she shares her story of going from 0 to podcast in just 4 tiny little hours. It's totally possible for you to create your podcast fast. And Nicole is living proof of that. And in the episode, she'll share her favorite way to record her podcast. That brings us to the 9th episode I'd love for you to go back and take a listen to, number 247. What legacy do you want to leave? This is a big episode all about the ways in which a podcast can help you preserve the legacy you want to leave, and we dive into what it is you want to leave behind and how you want to be remembered. And a quote from that episode from Jim Rohn is this: all good men and women must take responsibility to create legacies that will take the next generation to a level we can only imagine. And the 10th episode is there's still time to launch your podcast this year, which was just released last week. We're coming up on the end of the year, on the end of this decade, and in the wise words of REM, they said it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. For the purposes of the episode, I took a little bit of liberty with the title and talked about how it's the end of the decade as we know it, but I want to feel more than fine. In this episode, I offer you a challenge about ending your year on a high note with a bang by launching your podcast versus what I've heard so many people talk about recently and letting the rest of the year just kind of fizzle out and let it happen without much direct input. I want to be toasting you and your podcast as I raise my glass on New Year's Eve. I hope that you're with me in that sentiment. And again, want to wrap up this episode by inviting you to join me inside of Podcast in a Weekend. You can get all the details and save your seat at today's show notes, youngpratt.com/249. With that, my friends, I want to wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. I'm sending lots of joy your way as you spend time with your family, reflect on all that you're thankful for, and dream big with these 10 episodes inspired to help you dream and create a podcast of your very own that you can still launch in this year because we still have 5 weeks to go or thereabout, and there's still plenty of time to make your podcast a reality. On that note, happy Thanksgiving. I will catch you all next time. Cheers.